Welcome to Devils in the Details. I am your host, Annie DeGraw. Today, we are talking all things infrastructure. Now, this is not the infrastructure you always think of: roads, bridges, water pipes. Infrastructure has changed significantly over the last few decades, including things like high-speed internet, electric vehicle charging stations. Many of these changes are due to a focus on sustainability. Two ASU professors have recently written a book on this exact topic, The Rightful Place of Science, Infrastructure in the Anthropocene. Rolls right off the tongue, and they are both joining us today. Professor Mikhail Chester is an associate professor at the School of Sustainable Engineering and the Built Environment, and Professor Braden Allenby is a Lincoln Professor of Engineering and Ethics and a President's Professor also at the School of Sustainable Engineering and the Built Environment. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Annie.
First question, Professor Chester, will go to you. Like I mentioned, the definition of infrastructure, it's no longer construction workers sitting at the top of a building in New York City overlooking I-beams. It's changed a lot. And a lot of that has to do on the nation's focus on sustainability. What is infrastructure now, and how should we be thinking of it?
That's right. Yeah, infrastructure has changed a lot since the 80s and how we define it. So we tend to think of it somewhat as hardware focused, but over time, and most recently, we've seen it take on a number of different dimensions. So both in regards to sustainability as well as resilience challenges, but also recognizing the increasing complexity of the space that is infrastructure. So digital information communication systems, for example, are not always purely physical. So we've seen the definition evolve to take on a number of different domains. So infrastructure as information comes in. We even see infrastructure design described in a much broader sense under, for example, context of social dimensions as well as ecological dimensions, so ecological infrastructure. And obviously all of those are at play when we think about concepts like sustainability or resilience, leveraging social capacities, ecological capacities, as well as our technical capabilities.
And of course, that's so important because the infrastructure that we're putting in today will hopefully last for many, many generations. Professor Allenby, next question is for you. Recently, the American Society of Civil Engineers put out their 2021 report card, giving the nation of America a C-. And Arizona received a C, so slightly above the national average. What are the most immediate concerns in terms of our national infrastructure, and are we too late?
Well, the good news is that we're not too late. The bad news is that funding infrastructure is a significant problem, in part because we've let deficiencies build up over time. The early railroads are a cautionary tale. The ICC, the Interstate Commerce Commission, limited the railroads' rates in such a way that they were able to recover their variable costs, that is the cost of running the train, but they couldn't recover their capital costs, the costs of building new plant, new track. So what happened was American railroads were stifled in a way that has led the American railroad system to be significantly less functional than, say, the European system. We do the same thing with most of our physical infrastructure. We only invest in it when we have to fix something that went wrong. That, of course, is a very expensive way to manage your infrastructure. And it means that you're always on the verge of having significant problems occur, whether it's roads that become essentially impassable because of potholes, whether it's fragmentation of the grid. One of the reasons that Texas ran into problems, for example, with their grid is they weren't interconnected. So we continually fix our infrastructure, but we don't invest enough to bring it up to snuff. So that's one set of issues: legacy infrastructure and making it work, which is critical to the American economy. The second set is, as Professor Chester pointed out, there's a lot of changes coming down the pike. And the way that we conceptualize infrastructure has to be a lot more sophisticated. If I give you the job to put in 10 miles of track, that's traditional. I know how to do it. But if I give you the job to put in broadband in such a way that I support the evolution of a 21st century economy, we really don't know how to do that. And even as you and I talk, 5G is being rolled out, along with additional AI capability in the system itself, changing the very nature of the infrastructure. In some senses, the biggest challenge we have today in sustainability is a form of infrastructure. We now dominate the dynamics of the climate system in ways that we're not used to thinking about, and we're certainly not good at handling. In some senses, the world itself is becoming infrastructure. And the challenge to future engineers is understanding how to respond to that, while at the same time not losing the capability to work on our legacy infrastructures.
These infrastructure have become political. They shouldn't necessarily become political, but because their payout and their payoff is not immediate, they are generational. It has unfortunately become that way. Why is investment for infrastructure so critical right now? And where should we be investing those dollars first?
It's critical now because the disconnect between what our current infrastructure can do, which are rooted in many ways, the past century, and what we need them to do is rapidly growing. There's a chasm growing between those two things. So when we think about what infrastructure should do in the future, it's wrapped up in a number of questions around what we want our infrastructure to do, what we think our infrastructure are going to be, as well as the potential chaos around us from, for example, extreme climate events, disruptors like new technologies coming in, disruptors like new players coming in, for example, Tesla moving into energy spaces, Amazon doing drone delivery as an alternative form of infrastructure. So as we think about what we want to deploy, there's often this tension between, to the earlier point, infrastructure being these sort of legacy technologies like roads, bridges, power lines, and so on, but more so the importance of thinking about what they need to be in the future, right? So in some ways, we have some sense of what that might be. In other ways, we don't know yet, right? So if we say how robust should infrastructure be against extreme climate events, the answer might be, well, we don't quite know. There's too much uncertainty there. Or, how might our grandchildren use a coupled physical mobility system like buses and cars versus virtual connectivity? We don't know. Will we be entirely virtual or not? So what becomes really important is the ability to pivot. Designing in agility, flexibility, that should be forefront in terms of what we do, in terms of giving us some sense of deploying what we might be able to see as what the needs might be in the next 10 to 20 years, but then giving ourselves the ability to say, okay, in those 10 to 20 years, we're going to learn a lot more about what we want our infrastructure to do. And therefore, we need to be able to change it. And then, of course, the other piece is climate adaptation. So, we've gotten to this point where our infrastructure are modeled based on assumptions about stability in the climate that are no longer valid. And any solution to what we do about infrastructure into the future needs to think about, or needs to focus on, not just adapting to climate extreme events, but also mitigating against making those events even worse.
They need to be the solution and also not part of the problem. I think my hope eventually for infrastructure is that we do eventually look like the Jetsons and we're flying around in electric vehicles. If you could help with that, that would be great. Professor Allenby, last question is for you. You mentioned this earlier, new tools that are helping us roll out these infrastructure. How are these new technologies helping us modernize our infrastructure in a way that our forefathers could have never even thought about?
Well, the obvious place to look is the combination of artificial intelligence, big data, and analytics, which is creating an environment where smart infrastructure isn't the exception, it's the rule. buildings that are capable of an element of self-management, Tesla cars on the road. Uh, what this does is this means that you've got to look at the integration of infrastructure, not just at the specific level that we traditionally work at. Some people learn water infrastructure, other people do telecommunications. It's all integrated, because if you think about, for example, the Internet of Things, that is creating a global infrastructure of sensors and information processing capability and AI that is highly reflexive. Tesla vehicles talk to Tesla Central, which integrates their knowledge and ships it back out to Tesla vehicles. So what you're seeing is the beginning of an evolution of cognitive structures that are embedded essentially in all infrastructure around the world. That's not a concept that most engineers are being trained to understand and a context within which they can work. There's one critical example that I think shows how badly behind the times we are, and that is every engineer that we teach to build these information structures into their designs because it makes them better and more efficient and more flexible. It also means that when you talk about geopolitical conflict, those elements of infrastructure are significant security risks. Everything we're putting in the Internet of Things today is a security risk. So what we're doing essentially is we're building modern infrastructure, but it's so new to us that we're building it in ways that are profoundly unstable, particularly when it comes to security.
That's a great point, and I think particularly with the idea that ASU tries to promote in terms of cross-disciplinary teaching of the security systems on top of the infrastructure, on top of thinking about what's going to be needed 15 to 20 years from now. Hopefully makes them better prepared, but certainly an interesting rabbit hole to go down there. Professor Chester, Professor Allenby, time went by quickly. This was fascinating. I want to thank both of you for joining us today. And for all of our viewers, you will hear a lot about infrastructure in the upcoming months. Thank you for joining us today. And until next time, stay safe.